It was a regular Saturday morning, calm, peaceful, and perfect for a bit of relaxation. But the serenity didn't last long. From my window, I saw her, Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, standing in her front yard. I thought it was just another of her usual neighborhood checks. She was always out there, scrutinizing everything, making sure every lawn was trimmed, every fence was in perfect shape. But then, I noticed something that made my heart race. She was holding something in her hand, something shiny and metallic. At first, I didn't know what it was, but as I squinted, I realized what she had. Pepper spray. My stomach dropped. Misty, my beloved cat, was out in the front yard, lounging in her favorite sunspot. She wasn't bothering anyone, just enjoying the warmth. But Karen? She was about to turn this peaceful moment into a nightmare. I ran outside, panic setting in, but before I could get to her, I saw it happen. Karen aimed the pepper spray directly at Misty, and I froze in disbelief. Misty's sharp, startled cry echoed through the yard as the spray hit her directly. She scrambled, yowling in pain and confusion, trying to get away from the cloud of burning mist. Karen stood there, watching her suffer with a twisted grin on her face. "Your cat doesn't belong here," Karen said coldly, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is my neighborhood, and I'm not putting up with it anymore." I could barely hold myself together. My heart was racing, adrenaline flooding my system. I scooped Misty up in my arms, rushing back inside, and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I cradled her, trying to comfort her as the effects of the pepper spray took their toll. She was trembling, clearly in pain, her eyes still squinting from the burn. I was livid. I couldn't believe what had just happened. How could someone be so cruel? How could Karen target my cat, of all things? Misty was no troublemaker. She was a sweet, gentle creature who loved nothing more than lounging in the sun. But to Karen, that wasn't enough. She had to have control, and Misty was just another casualty of her need to enforce her rules. But I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my phone and dialed animal control. They needed to know what had happened. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Not only had Karen harmed my cat, but she was also using her position to terrorize the neighborhood. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. But I didn't stop there. After explaining the situation to animal control, I realized something. This wasn't just about Misty. It was about standing up to someone who thought she could push people around. Who did Karen think she was? What if she'd done this before, to other animals? I had a feeling this wasn't an isolated incident. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I asked animal control to investigate her entire property. I didn't know what they would find, but I knew Karen's behavior wasn't just a one-time thing. If she was willing to harm my cat, who else had she targeted? What else was she hiding? I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I watched through the window as animal control arrived at Karen's house. The officers were professional, calm, and ready to do their job, but I knew this wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. Sure enough, when she saw the officers at her door, her posture immediately stiffened. I could see the tension in her face as they started asking her questions. She tried to act casual, claiming that the pepper spray was a justified precaution, that she was only trying to keep the peace. But her eyes betrayed her. There was something in the way she looked at the officers, something frantic, as if she knew this wasn't going to end well for her. The officers didn't fall for her act. They pressed on, asking about the spray, about other complaints she'd filed in the past. Karen stammered and shifted uncomfortably, but the officers were calm and methodical. They didn't let her dodge the questions. As the investigation continued, Karen's anxiety grew. The officers didn't stop at the spray incident. They wanted to know more. They checked the backyard, inspected the property, and started to ask her about the other pets in the neighborhood. They were thorough, asking questions about the animals she had reported or dealt with over the years. At first, Karen kept up her facade, but it was clear she was starting to crack under the pressure. The officers were too calm, too professional, and they weren't going to let her lie her way out of this. That's when things took an unexpected turn. The officers started investigating her backyard, and that's when they uncovered something disturbing. Beneath all the manicured flower beds and pristine garden fences, there was something hidden, something Karen had been keeping secret. They found a small, makeshift kennel hidden behind the fence, filled with dogs. Dozens of them. The conditions were appalling. The dogs were cramped in small, filthy cages, their fur matted, their eyes dull with neglect. It was clear that these animals hadn't been cared for properly. Some were malnourished, others had signs of untreated injuries. Karen had been running an illegal dog breeding operation right under everyone's nose. She had been selling the puppies for a profit, using her position as the HOA enforcer to keep everyone quiet. It was a profitable business for her, but at the cost of these poor animals' lives. The officers immediately started taking pictures and documenting the evidence. They called for backup, and the situation escalated quickly. What started as a simple investigation into an act of cruelty against my cat had now turned into something far bigger, something that exposed Karen for the fraud and animal abuser she truly was. Karen's world was falling apart. She had been using her influence in the HOA to keep her illegal operation hidden. No one had suspected a thing. She had built this facade of authority, bullying neighbors with her rules, while behind closed doors, she was breaking the law and mistreating animals for profit. The officers worked quickly, taking down all the information they needed and removing the dogs from her property. The investigation was far from over, but already, Karen's life was unraveling in ways she hadn't imagined. The HOA that had once been her playground was now the thing that would expose her darkest secrets. As I watched all of this unfold from my front window, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. Karen had finally crossed the line, and now she was paying for it. My decision to involve animal control had turned out to be the right one. Not only was my cat safe, but the truth had been exposed. Karen thought she could control the neighborhood, but in the end, it was her own lies and cruelty that led to her downfall. The investigation continued, and the more animal control dug into Karen's life, the more unsettling things became. As the officers questioned her, Karen's facade of the perfect, well-intentioned neighbor crumbled. Her hands trembled as they took pictures of the sickly dogs, their conditions unfit for any living creature. The officers were firm, not letting her slip away with excuses. It was clear that Karen had been running this operation for quite some time, hidden beneath the veil of her self-imposed HOA authority. And it wasn't just the animals in her backyard. As the investigation went deeper, it became evident that Karen's need for control went far beyond the boundaries of her property. Her entire life had been built on manipulating situations to suit her, all under the guise of enforcing order. The officers worked efficiently, documenting every single thing they found, from the neglected animals to the hidden breeding tools. They even uncovered her financial records, which showed a disturbing pattern of profits made from selling these mistreated dogs. But the most shocking part came when they found her correspondence with several other breeders, some of whom had been operating in illegal conditions as well. Karen wasn't just a rogue HOA enforcer. She was part of a much larger underground network of illegal breeding. As I stood across the street, watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. I was angry at Karen for what she had done to Misty, but now, seeing the extent of her operation, I felt a deep sense of betrayal. Karen wasn't just a petty, self-righteous neighbor. She was a criminal who had been hiding behind the facade of HOA rules to cover her tracks. The officers took their time, making sure they had everything in order before they moved forward with the next steps. They contacted animal welfare organizations, coordinating with them to remove the animals and provide them with proper care. The dogs, some of them just puppies, were finally going to get the attention they deserved. But there was no denying that Karen's life was about to be turned upside down. Karen was arrested later that afternoon, her world collapsing in on her. The neighbors who had once feared her were now watching in disbelief as she was handcuffed and escorted away. The woman who had once held so much power in the neighborhood, who had used her position to control and manipulate others, was now facing the consequences of her own actions. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The fear and power that Karen had used to intimidate us all had come back to bite her. But it wasn't just about Karen. The truth was, her abuse of power had affected more than just me. It had affected the entire neighborhood. People had been too afraid to speak up, too scared to go against her for fear of retaliation. As I walked back inside, Misty curled up on my lap, purring softly. I knew that things were about to change. The neighborhood would never be the same again. Karen's reign was over, and the truth had finally come to light. But the most important lesson from all of this? Sometimes standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's always worth it. I could hear the whispers in the neighborhood long before the police cars and animal control trucks left. Karen's arrest had been a spectacle. People who had once feared her, who had tiptoed around her rules, were now openly discussing her downfall. Some were in disbelief. Others were angry that they hadn't spoken up sooner. It was clear that Karen had created an environment of fear, using her role as an enforcer of rules to keep everyone in check. But once her secrets came to light, all of that power vanished in an instant. In the days that followed, things in the neighborhood began to settle into a new normal. The residents were still processing the shock of what had happened, but there was a sense of relief in the air. People no longer had to live in fear of Karen's overbearing scrutiny. The HOA meetings, which had once been tense affairs, now had an air of freedom to them. The neighbors who had once been too afraid to challenge her were now speaking openly about the changes they wanted to see. As for me, I wasn't interested in becoming the neighborhood hero. All I cared about was Misty's safety. She was recovering well from the pepper spray incident, and I could tell she was beginning to trust again. But I couldn't shake the thought that Karen's downfall was only the beginning of something much larger. The investigation into her illegal breeding operation was just the tip of the iceberg, and I had a feeling that more was going to come to light. Weeks passed, and things seemed to calm down, but the investigation into Karen's activities was far from over. The authorities were still digging into her business dealings, and there was talk of other people being involved. It wasn't long before they uncovered a network of breeders who had been operating under the radar, just like Karen. The connections were more widespread than anyone had imagined. But it wasn't just about the animals anymore. Karen's actions had exposed a deep-seated problem within the neighborhood. People had been too afraid to speak up, to challenge her authority. The HOA, which was meant to create harmony, had become a tool of oppression in Karen's hands. Her actions had revealed just how easy it was for someone with power to manipulate others. It was a hard lesson for everyone to learn, but it was a necessary one. The community had been forced to confront the reality of what had been happening behind the scenes. The fear that had once controlled us had been shattered, and the truth had set us free. As the weeks went by, the aftermath of Karen's arrest continued to ripple through the neighborhood. The scandal had shaken the foundation of what we thought was a peaceful, orderly community. The HOA, once a place where rules were enforced with a rigid hand, now felt like a joke. The idea that one person could hold so much power over the lives of everyone else seemed absurd. But it had happened, and now people were talking. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down, afraid to speak up against Karen, were starting to stand tall. No longer were they willing to let someone like her control their every move. A meeting was called to discuss what to do next. The air was charged with energy, a mixture of frustration and newfound freedom. It wasn't just about moving on from Karen's reign. It was about making sure that something like this never happened again. As the meeting unfolded, I listened intently. People were starting to share their stories about how Karen had affected their lives. One neighbor spoke about how she'd harassed them for leaving their garage door open for too long. Another shared how Karen had written her up for planting the wrong flowers in her garden, flowers that didn't conform to her idea of what was appropriate. It became clear that Karen's need for control had extended into every aspect of the neighborhood's life. It wasn't just about enforcing HOA rules. It was about exerting power over the smallest, most insignificant details. For the first time in years, the room felt united. No one was afraid to speak anymore. Karen's cruelty had revealed a truth that none of us had fully realized before. We were stronger together than apart. And together, we were going to reclaim control of our neighborhood. But the work wasn't done. Despite the relief that came with Karen's arrest, the damage she had caused couldn't be erased overnight. We needed to make sure that the HOA was no longer an instrument of oppression. It was time to rewrite the rules. The new leadership, elected by the community, vowed to ensure that the HOA would serve the interests of the residents, not just one person's twisted vision of order. With Karen out of the picture, it felt like the neighborhood was slowly healing. There was a sense of trust being rebuilt, a sense of unity that had been missing for far too long. People started working together, organizing community events, and taking pride in their homes and their neighborhood. It was as if we had all been given a second chance. As for me, I felt a sense of closure. Misty had recovered fully from the pepper spray incident, and though I still couldn't forget what Karen had done, I knew that I had done the right thing. Sometimes standing up to someone like Karen isn't easy, but the truth always comes to light. But even after everything had calmed down, there was still the lingering question. How had Karen managed to keep her illegal breeding operation hidden for so long? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one woman's cruelty. It was about a much larger issue. How many other people in our community had used their positions of power for personal gain? How many other neighborhoods had fallen victim to this kind of manipulation? The answers weren't easy to find, but the search for them had begun. People were finally asking the right questions, refusing to let things slide anymore. The truth had a way of changing everything, and it had changed this neighborhood for the better. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as I looked around at the community that had come together in the wake of Karen's downfall. We weren't just residents of a neighborhood anymore. We were a collective, stronger and more resilient because of what we had gone through. Karen had underestimated us, thinking that her reign of terror could last forever. But we had proven her wrong. We had found our voice, and nothing would silence us again. And so, as the sun set on another peaceful evening, I realized that sometimes it takes the worst of people to bring out the best in others. We had come together in the face of adversity, and now, nothing seemed impossible. The future was ours to shape. And that's the story. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Stay tuned for more shocking twists and stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.